Hello and welcome to the video. Today we have another narrated short story titled The New King of Morrow Marsh Part 2. I hope you enjoy. The morning sunlight brought warmth to Taryn's face for the first time in nearly 2 days. The previous day had been overcast and cool, and the night, which now seemed like it had been a different week, had been cooler still. Taryn got to his feet. He was about to wake the rest of the group, but first, he knelt beside Balanos's tent. "I'm awake," Balanos said quietly. "Good, just checking." "Are you going to be okay today?" Taryn said, equally as quiet. "Don't worry about me," Balanos replied. Taryn stood again and proceeded to wake the others. Most of the group were running off a few hours' sleep, if that, so the mood at camp was quite tense. Taryn thought about the day ahead and how Nessa had gone back to the wagon. He didn't think that she would fully up and leave. Reynald had been pretty clear on what the outcome would be if that were to happen. The Arundel spymaster had said his protection would only be granted as long as they were doing his bidding. "Where do we go from here?" Artair said, wiping the sleep out of his eyes. "We'll head over to where the villagers were attacked last night. Hopefully we can find a clue as to where this rat king of ours is hiding," Taryn said, shouldering his pack. "I'm worried," Thalia said, as she patted the enormous dog Brutus behind the ears. The dog was looking much better than he had the previous night. Nessa's potions must have worked wonders on all of them, considering how bad their injuries had seemed. "We bested 5 of those things last night, and no one died," Taryn said, as he helped Thalia with her pack. "Speak for yourself. My shoulder still hurts," Artair said, swinging his pack onto his good shoulder. "It will probably take us an hour or so to get across the battlefield," Taryn said, pointing to the spot where the villagers had been attacked. "So, let's get a move on, shall we?" he added, and the group prepared to once again trudge through Morrow Marsh. Thalia walked along, careful to avoid stepping into any puddles. The day before, Brutus had jumped into one, and it had ended up being deep enough to completely submerge him. Princess or not, she didn't like the sound of swimming in water that contained the runoff from a recent battlefield. Thalia's only grasp on military might was from the parades that she had seen march through Arun High. They had always looked so majestic. Even the infantrymen and archers still had a sense of pride, but here it looked like 50,000 men simply died in the mud, scared to death. The battle was a few months ago now, but the flora and fauna still hadn't come back. Thalia could imagine the gently rolling hills of this valley, covered in grass or neatly segmented crop fields. It would be a beautiful sight. Here and there, a waist-high stone wall divided up a field, but their most common obstacles were the corpses. Men in groups of about 10 or 20 were piled together, not even stripped for gear. Taryn had told her that once a battle was over, any prisoners that had survived and could still walk were usually tasked with collecting any weapons and armor that were still useful from the deceased. Not from this battle. The land was so muddy that you couldn't get a cart in or out. Even hand-carrying gear would have taken a long time. Instead, King Ventus had ordered his army to march on toward the Morzend capital further north. So the battleground was left. Taryn had also said that usually all manner of birds and beasts would have come and had their fill of a battlefield like this, but the villagers had said that once the rats moved in, all other wildlife in the area had stopped coming through this way. Thalia's thoughts were interrupted when Taryn grabbed her roughly by the shoulders. She looked up to see his index finger over his lips, begging for silence. As he held her, they both started to crouch, lowering themselves behind a scraggly mass that presumably used to be a hedgerow. Now that she was paying attention and they were all silent, she could hear something. It sounded like someone was dragging and ripping up a sack of grain or flour. She had heard a similar sound in the palace's kitchens. Curious, she hobbled over to Taryn's back and almost had to jam her fist into her mouth to keep herself from screaming. Just ahead of them, 2 massive rats were ripping apart a very bloated body. With a sickening crunch and a squelch, the body was divided. She turned away from the sight, only to come face to face with Brutus, who was sniffing the air frantically. Thalia put her hands around the dog's face and focused, pushing calm thoughts into his mind. "Don't make a sound. We need to keep as quiet as possible, okay?" she projected. With a slight dip of his head that almost looked like a nod of acceptance, the dog stopped pushing its way forward, and Thalia turned back to find Taryn standing upright. The beasts were gone, and there was a pair of large, dark trails that led off toward a dead tree trunk. "They've just dragged the body under there. My guess is they're taking it into some sort of tunnel," Taryn said, turning back to the group. "Please tell me we aren't going to be crawling through a mud-soaked tunnel the size of one of those rats," Artair said with obvious disgust. "I'd guess they have a number of those tiny entrances. We need to find the hub. Then we can decide if we need to worry about the tiny tunnels or not," Taryn replied as he slung his pack back onto his shoulders. "The place where the villagers were attacked is just over that hilltop. We can't be more than 15 minutes away. I'd suggest we head up there and start looking around," Taryn said, before pausing to consider for a moment. "What do you think?" he asked. Thalia wasn't used to being asked what she thought of the plan, so she looked at Artair, who also seemed taken aback. She looked back to Taryn. "It seems like the best option for the moment," Thalia said. Artair nodded his head in agreement, and Balanos gave a non-committal harumph. So the group proceeded onward. They reached another hillock, similar to the one they had camped on the night before. The only difference was that here, above the mud and muck, the ground was stained with dark red splotches, as if some painter had used the dry earth as their canvas. "I guess that solves it. None of the villagers survived," Artair said, crouching to pick through what looked like a coin purse, which was, of course, empty. "I think the trail leads off this way," Taryn said, as he walked over to the far side of the hillock. Brutus, running his nose along the ground, suddenly lifted his head and woofed deeply. "I guess Brutus agrees with you, Taryn," Thalia said, scratching the giant dog's belly. Artair looked into the distance, in the direction that Taryn and the hound had predicted the tracks led, but through the debris it was hard to pick out any landmarks. Artair climbed onto a partially charred, overturned wagon and looked around. "What do you see, lad?" Taryn called. "Not much, except the destroyed camp, the spot where we stopped, and what looks like some sort of old chapel," Artair said, his hand shading his eyes. About 25 meters away, in the direction they had been heading, was a small square building with a domed roof. "It's the only structure that's still standing," he said, as he deftly jumped back down onto the ground. "All right, well, we don't have all day," Balanos grumbled. Artair and Taryn shared a glance. It was almost the first thing the old man had said all day. Without waiting for confirmation, Balanos marched off toward the chapel. Up close, the building was roughly 12 meters squared. It was also quite tall, easily stretching to twice Taryn's height. It had tiny windows up near the roof that were only wide enough to fit an arm through. Artair walked around to the front of the building, which seemed to be facing north. There were dozens of footprints coming and going from the building, and it looked busy, judging by the number of wagons and carts parked all around the entrance. Taryn drew his sword and pulled his shield off his back, then gestured to the rest of the group to ready themselves. Carefully, Artair opened the front doors and walked into the building. As soon as he did, he was assaulted by the stench of rotting corpses. The marsh had seemed almost unbearable, but at least it was outside and there was a slight breeze. This, however, was something different altogether. Although the day was bright and there were many windows, The way they were positioned only allowed light halfway up the walls, making the floor very dark. There were dozens of tables, chairs, and pews all over the small room, all of them awash with dried blood and dirty bandages. "Looks like they used this building as an aid station," Balanos said, nervously pointing his bow around. "If it were an aid station, wouldn't there be bodies?" Artair asked, as he checked under a makeshift wooden table. "Not if the rats have eaten everyone," Taryn said. "You saw how they dragged those bodies away. It seems they've even started turning to the rotting corpses on the battlefield." He walked to the end of the room. "What do we have here?" he murmured, and Artair joined him. There was a small trapdoor in the floor of the building. It was made of wood, but there was no latch. Artair assumed it was for storage, or to hide idols or other religious paraphernalia, but Balanos piped up again. "It will most likely be the entrance to this chapel's catacombs. I've seen dozens of buildings like this over the years. They are built to serve one old god or the other. Then an invading force comes through, and rather than destroy it, they just change the decor slightly to appeal to the new god or gods," Balanos said, leaning against the wall as he looked down at Taryn and Artair. "I bet a full purse I know where our Rat King friend has come from as well." "Where?" Artair asked. "I reckon the thing was living down in these catacombs, and the sound, or more likely the smell, of all those wounded soldiers has brought the thing out of hiding," Balanos replied. "It's not a bad theory," Thalia said, walking over to the others. "Regardless of how or why it's here, we still need to kill this thing. So, are we going down there or not?" Taryn said. Artair was used to walking through cramped sewers and dark attics, but catacombs where they might be ambushed by giant rats at any moment were another thing entirely. His concern must have shown on his face, because Taryn said, "I'll go first, and the rest of you can follow me." Then he opened the trapdoor and pointed his sword down into the hole. Only it wasn't really a hole at all. Artair had expected a ladder, or even simply a drop into the chamber below, but instead there was a ramp that gradually led down into the darkness. Only after looking closely did Artair realize that the ramp was made from piles of bones. "Wonderful," Balanos said with mock cheerfulness. Taryn was preparing a torch from his pack when Artair turned to Thalia. "I don't think this is going to be the best place for the pooch." Thalia looked at Brutus, then to the hole, then back to Brutus. "I suppose you're right. All right, my brave boy. You're going to have to stay here and wait for us. We might need to send you to get help or something, so don't fall asleep, okay?" As she said this, she held the massive dog's head in her hands. "Does grabbing the dog like that help him understand, or what?" Artair asked, grinning. "I'm not sure, but he seems to do what I say when I do it. And I like giving him my full attention when I speak to him." Thalia finished the sentence with a big smile and a tug on the dog's cheeks. "All right, kids, are we all ready?" Taryn asked, and Artair and Thalia both rolled their eyes. "Yes, father," Artair said, but his grin disappeared as he looked down at the trapdoor. Taryn lit the torch and the group proceeded steadily down the macabre incline. The path twisted and turned, and Thalia had never felt so claustrophobic. They had climbed down 4 or 5 flights of stairs that switched back on themselves, so that the only real direction they were travelling in was down. Finally, they came to a larger room that held many sarcophagi. Upright tombstones covered the entryways to the crypts that were placed all throughout the chamber. Around the room were patches of dry blood, bones, and several piles of clothes and armour. The dry blood on the floor drew an almost perfect line toward one of the crypts, whose wall-mounted tombstone had been shattered outward. It wasn't until they approached the crypt that Thalia heard it. She froze and tapped Artair on the shoulder. "Food. Bring me more food." The voice was faint but clear enough that she could make out the words. "Did you hear that?" Thalia asked Artair immediately. "Hear what? All I hear is our own breathing," Artair replied. "No, I can hear a voice. It's hungry." The whole group turned toward her, concern on their faces. "Maybe it was just one of us, thinking about food," Taryn suggested. "No, it sounded like someone or something that hasn't been taught how to speak properly. And besides, I know how you all think well enough to be able to rule you out," Thalia said. She thought she caught Balanos wrinkle his face at the mention of reading minds. "Don't worry, I only do it during an emergency. I really don't like knowing other people's thoughts. Most of the time, people are thinking of things that no one else should know about." She smiled and went to continue, but Taryn shushed everyone. "Shh, I can hear something. It's coming from in there." As Thalia approached the crypt, she saw that it was empty. Where the coffin should have been, there was a hastily dug hole, tunneling deeper into the crypt. "I'll go first again, but maybe you should all wait back a bit until I know the passage is safe," Taryn suggested, and Thalia was more than happy to oblige him. Taryn handed the torch to Balanos and proceeded to crawl through the dark hole. After a moment or two, he called back. "All right, it's safe to come through. It's not a very long tunnel. Balanos, can you pass through the torch?" Balanos gave the other two a grave look and began to climb through the tunnel, with the torch stretched out in front of him. "Me next. There's no way I'm going to be left alone in this dark room," Thalia said as she hurried in behind Balanos. At the end of the tunnel there was a short drop onto the dirt floor. Balanos handed the torch back to Taryn and caught Thalia. A moment later, Artair jumped down to join them. They were standing in a dirt intersection. Around them, 5 or 6 tunnels branched out, each as tight as the one they had just crawled through, all except one, which was nearly tall enough to stand up in. I smell something," came the voice inside Thalia's head. "A strong smell of liquor. We have visitors, it would seem." Thalia gasped. "Whatever it is, it knows we are here. Apparently, it can smell a wine or something," Thalia whispered. The group turned to stare at Balanos, whose shocked expression quickly changed to rage. "How in the bloody hells is that possible?" he said quietly. Suddenly, there was a loud scratching followed by a tack-tack-tack sound. Instinctively, the 4 of them turned around and faced the incoming tunnels, backs to each other. The sounds grew louder, and seconds later, giant rats were upon them. There wasn't enough room in the cavern for him to fire his bow, so Balanos had pulled his short hunting dagger. The rats bounced into them, moving so quickly it was nearly impossible to get his hands on one long enough to do any damage. Still, he seemed to be faring better than Thalia. Under the weight of the attack, she had slumped to the floor. "Taryn, get the girl!" Balanos shouted as he dove forward. With all his strength, he shoved 2 of the rats away from Taryn, giving him just enough breathing room to grab the princess. Taryn scooped Thalia up, shield raised to keep the beasts from jumping on him. Artair was slashing madly with his knife, and Balanos was doing the same, but it made no difference to the swarm of massive rats. It seemed helpless to fight back. Balanos was about to give up when he felt something brush his ankle. He looked down to see some kind of rope being pulled over his skin. One of the dog-sized rats jumped onto his chest and crawled its way over his shoulder. Before he knew it, a crude net was being pulled over his head, pinning his arms to his torso. He felt his back press against Taryn's, while Artair's shoulder was rammed against his, the force of the net pulling them together. Balanos thanked the gods that his blade wasn't pointing toward himself, as his feet were pulled out from beneath him, and his body crashed onto the ground. He heard Artair wheeze and Taryn give a grunt of pain, as the 4 of them began to be dragged. Balanos felt his body bruising as the rats dragged them roughly through one of the tunnels. The pain was nearly unbearable. They were pulled into a massive cavern which was covered in stalactites and stalagmites. When they had reached the center of the room, the rats proceeded to climb all over them. Balanos watched as they attached a large hook to the net. Slowly, the net was hoisted into the air, the bodies of the misfits being crushed together as the net swung free. Balanos breathed in cold air and tried to make himself more comfortable, doing his best not to crush anyone too seriously. As the sounds of gnashing teeth and scurrying feet quieted, he began to hear a slow dripping sound. The net spun lazily, and Balanos looked out over the cavern. Rats covered almost every surface, but one of them was much larger than the rest. "Wait!" Thalia shouted. "You aren't going to eat us, and I can tell you why, O great Rat King." To be continued. That was The New King of Morrow Marsh Part 2. It is the second last episode of the season, so if you've missed any of the others, consider going back and getting up to date. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and comment any feedback you have, as it really does help me out. And consider subscribing, as there will be more content to come. This was a Tello Tale. Thanks for watching.